They call it Cryptonite.
Well, I don't care what they call it. Did you say Cryptonite?
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for the patience. If you're joining us live on Facebook, welcome. If you're watching this after the live stream, welcome. My name is Carlos Rios. I am the marketing partner of BIOS. This is the Cryptonite Hackathon, the e-hackathon hosted by BIOS, a Toronto and New York contact tracing app. Now, before we get started, and to give you guys some context in case you're just joining us now, as we saw in the video and as we've seen in the past couple of months, contact tracing and just solutions to this pandemic have become a priority for a very large number of governments and jurisdictions. Now, what we are trying to do in this event is find a way to show how BIOS chooses to store its data when it comes to contact tracing, and more importantly, to show that everything we collect is anonymous and fully encrypted. We have Dr. Sharkawy, a correspondent for CTV. He's an internal medicine and infectious disease expert with the University of Health Network and the University of Toronto. He has been featured on media outlets around the world for his insights and analysis on the COVID pandemic. He is also the lead infectious disease consultant on CTV News. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to maybe say a little bit about yourself and your thoughts around COVID-19, how hospitals are dealing with it, and what we can expect from a technology like BIOS, perhaps, how it can help?
Thank you so much for the invitation. And for those who don't know me, I'm an internal medicine and infectious disease consultant with the University Health Network and the University of Toronto. I am usually seen on CTV News pretty regularly, trying to help keep Canadians updated on the status of this pandemic. And I think what I've been seeing during the course of this pandemic is something quite extraordinary, very unique, in that we're seeing the intersection of so many different domains of our society being subjected to a real test here, whether you're talking about medical research, health infrastructure, or when we talk about apps and things that are important in terms of tracking disease activity, we're talking about technology. And it's really presented us with a tremendous set of challenges to try and coordinate efforts towards recognizing that unless we're very collaborative and unless we're also very open-minded about different opportunities and sort of stretching our level of comfort into areas that we're not really used to, we don't really stand a great deal of hope in managing something like this. I love the example given by Mark just a moment ago here about syphilis. Not that it's very much comparable to COVID-19 in terms of the way it's transmitted, but the principle of something that can happen very insidiously and happen without a lot of notice. The vast majority of my syphilis patients don't have any symptoms. They don't have a rash. They don't have any telltale features that suggest they have the disease other than a test that I do on them. And then it's incumbent upon me to make sure that we retrace our steps and find out who exactly this individual was exposed to, what was the nature of their interaction, what sort of web is behind the risk exposure that they have been a part of to protect everybody else. And, the same principle really holds true for COVID-19. It's true that our ERs and our ICUs are not overwhelmed right now. They're not flooded with people that are literally dying, the same way we saw images from Italy and parts of New York City not all that long ago. But that doesn't mean the problem is gone. And it really speaks to this idea of an invisible enemy, something that's very insidious, that's very difficult to identify. And if we are not able to really grasp that and understand that we have to be extremely proactive, we have to be very investigative in our ability to go out there into the community and find out where the links are between people who've been exposed, for people who are confirmed cases, we are setting ourselves up for a renewed pandemic. And that's the fear that I have right now, is that things are dying down enough that the chaos that people sort of expected or had seen in other parts of the world is not what we're experiencing at this point in time. But if we let our guard down and assume we have to stop looking for this, we're in big trouble. And so we have to be as proactive as possible. We have to use whatever means we can to go out there and test people and to trace in the most efficient way possible. I love the idea of the BIOS app because what it really does is it seems to strike that perfect balance between efficiency in terms of identifying and being able to convey information about people who are confirmed as positive for this disease, and ensuring that important privacy information and confidentiality is not breached. And really, that's at the fundamental heart of the issue here is how much are you willing to give away in the course of wanting to help something that is part of a greater cause? You know, that's a very difficult thing to answer. Each one of us wants to help, and we don't want to see our community suffer. But we're not necessarily willing to do that at the cost of our own personal privacy, and we can see how easily that can be breached nowadays with all kinds of hacking and so many interfaces that we're exposed to through our devices and our computers, you know, at any given moment. So what I've really been impressed with in looking at this app is it seems to have a really airtight security, design to it. I'm really interested in seeing what comes of this hackathon to see if anybody is able to sort of break through the shield. And, you know, if it proves to be something that is really reliable from that point of view, you know, I think it's so important for our governments and all forms of industry to really look at these, measures and to try and utilize them. Not everybody's tech savvy, but you know what? The earlier you start to adopt these strategies and the more success they have, you know, the more trust that we're going to have in them doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is helping to find out what's out there. You can't find what you're not looking for. So we need something like this. It's essential. It's very helpful. And I'm hopeful it'll replicate the same sort of success that places like South Korea, for example, and Japan and other parts of Southeast Asia have been able to see when they've been very, very good at adopting these strategies and having their populations accept them and embrace them as a useful part of a containment strategy.
Well, Doctor, respectfully, those Asian countries, they sometimes have an easier time of implementing these types of apps because, you know, they don't maybe view privacy data or, you know, how the population should implement certain applications the same way as the US or Canada. What do you think is the best way of educating a population such as the US or Canada as to, you know, this is a great app, this is the way we should adopt this, this is going to help and benefit society as a whole?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think what we probably want to get away from is arguments of what's more culturally palatable. You know, a lot of this is weighed into an argument of saying, well, these are authoritarian regimes that don't seem to have a great deal of respect for people's freedoms. I think that's the wrong argument. And probably not entirely accurate, because I don't really view South Korea as an authoritarian regime the way a lot of people might view, China. What we really need to look at is the essence of the difficulty in identifying this virus and looking at the fact that, you know, a lot of what we can measure as success doesn't necessarily have to do with just the number of tests that are done. I can do so many tests, you know, in a given day and not really identify what I need to in terms of where the problem is within my community. The real key is not just doing the test, but then finding the cases and identifying where those cases are linked to others that is not so easily understood. That's the key to defining where a problem is lurking, within my community and where a hotspot might emerge that I don't know and I can't see right now. And so having something, some form of a mechanism to guide you through that is really critical. And I think people need to embrace technology as a way to help us do things that are not so intuitively done in the archaic fashion of picking up a phone, writing things down on a piece of paper, using a fax machine, waiting for somebody to call you back. I mean, this is pre-1985 technology that we're expecting to use in a 2020 pandemic that has affected millions of people around the world. It just doesn't digest. So I think the sooner people recognize that we need help that goes beyond what we can do, with our hands and our eyes and our ears, we need, something that is highly efficient, that is technologically savvy. This is an instrument that we should embrace as something that's going to be able to help guide us through this. And the key again is just ensuring that the privacy and security issues are not something that people need to worry about. If we get past that, I think a lot of people will be in a much better place to say, I'm not giving a lot up here, and I have something that is really going to help me and help everyone around me. Everyone's got a billion apps on their phone. We use them for pretty much everything, from our banking to, our shopping to credit card information. This is our health here. What's more important than that? The health of ourselves, our neighbors, our relatives, our families. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to adopt that same level of confidence and trust in a technology that's going to help us in that regard as well.
Dr. Sharkawy, that's such a good point you just said about the fact that we already use technology with very sensitive data as it is. If you have time for a quick follow-up question, as you know, and I'm sure you're going to expect, we're going to be hitting a second wave. And if we learn anything from history, the second wave tends to be significantly stronger and affect us negatively much more so than the first wave. For those people watching, and just for the people that may not be so aware of the severity and differences in the second wave, if we do hit one, and what we've learned from the past, if we don't have a contact tracing solution, what is the world going to look like? What is it going to look like if we don't implement some sort of technology? Because like you said, we're using 1985 technology for contact tracing. If we have a significant surge in that second wave, are we even going to be able to handle it?
Well, that's exactly my fear. That's an excellent question. And just for the record, for people who are not aware, there has never been a pandemic in recorded history that has not had a second wave. So we have to be students of history and remind ourselves that we might change to a certain extent, but viruses don't, and infectious diseases don't in terms of the principles by which they spread throughout our communities. They don't care what we do. They just want a target, and they want to be able to spread as efficiently and as extensively as possible. So we would be well served to learn lessons from what has been working during this first wave of the pandemic. Where have successes been met in terms of strategies to identify and trace cases, to identify them quickly and prevent them from getting out of control? We don't have to go to South Korea. Let's go to Calgary. If you're talking about Canada, Canadian context, let's look at what happened around the meatpacking plant in Calgary. They did a very good job in being able to prevent that from becoming a whole-scale disaster across the province of Alberta because their intervention was very aggressive. They didn't stop at anything before they went to every stone unturned to identify where potential traces of this infection could have led to. And just imagine if that could be aided by technology in bigger centers and bigger cities, and to do it proactively, to identify, hotspots before they turn into full-fledged, outbreaks, not just in our communities, but in high-risk places like long-term care facilities and institutional settings that we know are breeding grounds for these infections. We're setting ourselves up for certain failure if we deny ourselves the opportunity to utilize these resources that have been proven to be effective and tremendously helpful towards stopping a problem before it became catastrophic. So I would say, we need to take every opportunity to embrace these sorts of technologies, and provided that the privacy issues are not a major concern, the rest becomes an issue of rolling it out. How do we get our ducks in a row here to make sure that the infrastructure is created and people can adopt this as widely as possible? We need to open up ourselves to that sense of open-mindedness, and not let fear get in our way, because that will certainly do us more harm than good.
Doctor, we talked a little bit about health. We talked about the second wave. These are all obviously top priority for anyone looking to address COVID-19. Why don't we change the conversation slightly and now look at the economic side of things? Because a lot of people might say that, the economy, what's happening to the economy, some might argue is worse than the disease itself, right? And there's people saying, I'd rather open up the business to help feed my children than to stay home and not be able to provide. So how can this technology maybe help restart the economy, whether it's first world countries or third world countries? A technology like this, what are your thoughts on how it can benefit?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that interestingly keeps being raised throughout this pandemic. And I find it quite interesting that it seems as though people have set up this sort of false dichotomy, that it has to be sort of either or, that you either support economic health or you support human health, and that somehow these two aims can't coexist. And I find that fundamentally unsatisfying and patently untrue. If you actually look at the basis of health economics, you find that if you are ignoring the health of your population and trying to forge ahead with only concerns of commercial enterprise being at the forefront of things, you won't succeed. In order for an economy to be healthy and for an industrial complex to work, you need a population base that is stable and healthy, and you need consumer trust to be bought back. And in the context of a pandemic, you want people to feel comfortable about being able to buy things and being able to spend things and go out and do what they would normally do in terms of their shopping habits. And there have been polls that have been done across parts of Canada that have showed a lot of people are very reluctant to re-engage the same shopping habits that they had pre-pandemic. So look, even if you want to look at it from a bottom line, economic standpoint, you're not getting back to where you want to be simply by opening up the economy and saying health be damned. There is a way to do both at the same time. And there's a way to keep your population base healthy and safe while opening up your industrial infrastructure and your commerce in a stepwise and strategic fashion. Again, I come back to the point of this being a difficult to identify virus. It's a difficult to identify condition. We've all seen the big kerfuffle of the World Health Organization's backpedaling on the statement that was made last week, where they initially said asymptomatic transmission wasn't a big concern. And, a 180 quickly thereafter, when this created quite a ruckus, and they said, okay, no, it's true. What we've been saying for a long time now is true. We don't know who has this infection more often than not. About 40% of people have no symptoms whatsoever when they have this infection. So when we look at, the summer unfolding and getting into the fall, looking at the prospects of the beginning of a flu season, which we know happens every year, there's no prediction around that, it's going to happen, okay? We want to make sure that we do everything that we can to avoid having the beginning of a second wave, or not the ending of this first wave, because it's not over in many parts of the world, meeting up with the beginning of the flu season. That will be potentially catastrophic from both a health standpoint and from an economic standpoint, because if people think the lockdowns that were happening now were severe, wait till you see what happens if you double on a flu outbreak within many of our high-risk areas in our communities and beyond that. That is something that I don't think anybody has any clue in terms of how severe that could be globally. we need to do what we can to avoid getting to that spot. If we embrace technology that's going to help us identify the situation before it ends up becoming one that is coalescing with a severe flu situation, we're in good stead. If we decide that we don't need that, we're setting ourselves up for certain disaster. And we have that choice. There's no reason why we can't make the right choice right now.
You're absolutely right. And you know what? If we had this technology happening, then they would have had that information early on, and it would have been a very different story. Dr. Sharkawy, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for this great opportunity to share some very interesting views. I wish you all the success you deserve, and I hope people will undertake this as a really important step towards hitting this pandemic where it needs to be hit and crushing this curve.
Absolutely, Doctor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are you all right, Mr. Kent?
Please, I'm all right. What happened to me?